what are the strong and persistent cross-sex behaviors?
Well, if one uses the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, there are an array of behaviors that, when they occur together, are instances of what is referred to as cross-gender behavior. So, for example, one criterion is a child expressing a strong desire to be of the other gender. Sometimes young children will also express a dislike about their sexual anatomy. But in young children, the more common behaviors are behaviors that are very observable in day-to-day life. So they might include wanting to wear clothing of the other gender, for example, to preschool or to elementary school, or in pretend play. Then there are various roles that children will prefer to enact in fantasy play. Then there is a preference for toys that are more stereotypically used by the other gender.
Right.
And then a preference to play with children of the other gender. When all of these behaviors occur together, that's what might lead to a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Now, one reason that these particular behaviors have been selected as part of the criteria is that, on average, these are behaviors that show pretty strong gender differences between typically developing boys and typically developing girls. And gender is in part a social construct that children learn about as they grow up, and they'll observe what other kids do, and then they wind up positioning themselves in relation to other kids.
This strong and persistent cross-sex behavior, at what age does this begin on average?
Well, in developmental gender psychology, there's been research going back decades that show that by age 2 to 3, kids who are of at least average intelligence, let's say, are pretty good at being able to self-label their gender identity. So if you ask a 2.5 or 3-year-old, are you a boy or a girl? The vast majority of kids will answer that question correctly. That doesn't mean that children at that age have a deep, sophisticated understanding of gender, but it's a rudimentary awareness of gender as a largely binary phenomenon. So kids can point out, who's a boy or who's a girl or who's a mommy and who's a daddy, that type of thing. And there are other studies using nonverbal techniques that show that even kids a little bit younger are aware of the generally binary nature of gender. So in children who are developing gender dysphoria, the first signs of it often appear at the same time in development that you see signs of gendered behavior in typically developing kids.
Wow. So in this study, do children with gender dysphoria have intense/obsessional interests? One quote that came out was, "The outside world with its sociocultural gender stereotypes perceive children experiencing gender dysphoria as discordant to the sex they were born with. Even young children sometimes adamantly reject or deny their own sex." What are some of the underlying causes of gender dysphoria?
Well, that's a $64 million question you're asking, which could take us the rest of the hour, but there are various theories about the development of gender dysphoria, just like there are various theories about gender identity development in typical kids. And in some respects, one could say that the theories are two sides of the same coin. So let's take a few examples. The first question is, to what extent are there biological influences that affect gender identity development in everybody? If there are biological influences, which aspect of biology are we talking about? So I'll give a couple of examples. Biological sex is defined by several parameters: genetic sex, hormonal sex, gonadal sex, internal reproductive structures, and the configuration of the external genitalia. Biological sex, if we define it beginning with chromosomal sex, people who are classified as female have two X chromosomes, and people who are classified as male have an X and a Y chromosome. By and large, children, adolescents, and adults with gender dysphoria have a chromosomal sex that is unremarkable in relation to the sex they were assigned to at birth. So genetic sex per se is probably not the place one would look at in terms of expecting some type of variation in the sex chromosome. Then another level are prenatal sex hormones. And it's the sex difference in the production of prenatal sex hormones that contribute in part to the differentiation of the external genitalia as male or female. So, for example, there's one physical intersex condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And in the case of genetic females, this endocrine abnormality leads to the excessive prenatal secretion of testosterone. And one impact of it is that it masculinizes the external genitalia of the female fetus. And so at the time of birth, sometimes the appearance of the external genitalia is so ambiguous that in the delivery room, it's not possible to declare, is the baby a boy or a girl?
Wow.
And sometimes the genitalia are so masculinized that the baby is, quote, labeled a boy. Now, in girls who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, for decades now you can treat the condition with medication so that once the condition is diagnosed around the time of birth, you can turn off the excessive secretion of testosterone. But still, there was the prenatal excess exposure to testosterone. And various studies have looked at what is the gendered behavior of girls who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And many studies, including some that I've done, show that on average, girls with this condition are more likely to show masculinized gender role behavior than, let's say, their unaffected sisters or comparison groups of other girls. A small percentage of them develop gender dysphoria, but the most visible evidence of the effect of prenatal androgen exposure is in their gendered role behavior. So many people have, wondered, to what extent do prenatal hormone factors play a role in kids who have gender dysphoria, but no evidence of a physical intersex condition. And the reason we say there's no evidence of it is that almost all children with gender dysphoria are born with external genitalia that are unremarkable, and there's no uncertainty about what their birth sex should be. So people have raised the question, well, is it possible that there are more subtle prenatal hormone influences that might affect the behavior of kids with gender dysphoria, where the subtle variation doesn't affect how their genitalia develop, but it does affect brain-related behaviors that are gendered. Wow. And that's not an unreasonable hypothesis, and people have tried to look for indirect markers of some type of prenatal hormone variation. So the point would be that, there are various potential biological hypotheses that might be implicated in the development of gender dysphoria. And one line of research that a number of people have been looking at over the past decade or so is whether or not we can identify regions of the brain that, on average, differ between males and females. And there are now a number of studies looking at those same regions in people who have gender dysphoria. Studies so far have primarily been with adults, but also some studies of adolescents. And because this research is still relatively new, it isn't as if definitive conclusions have been reached. But I think that it's a line of research that may eventually lead to, for example, evidence suggesting that maybe there are some regions of the brain that are shifted from one gendered pole to the other. Other regions, there's no difference. And then there may be other regions that are in between. So I'd say over the next 10 years we'll learn much more about whether or not MRI research might be informative in contributing to tests of biological factors. Now that's the biological. Then there's the psychosocial.
Yes.
And there are many hypotheses in the literature about what role do social factors play. And, for decades, people have been interested in the role of social factors that would explain the differences between typically developing boys and girls. So, one theory about gender is that it's a social construction. And so a social constructionist would say, you're not born with a gender, your gender is made.
Right.
And certainly, back in the 60s and early 70s, that was certainly a strong position that feminists would make about gender development, that so much of the differences one sees between boys and girls can be accounted for by socialization factors. So you think about, early elements of gender socialization. When a baby is born, what's the most commonly asked question? Not what are the colors of the baby's eyes?
Right.
Or does the baby have hair? Is it a boy or a girl?
Right.
Is it a boy or a girl? Many parents give names that are gender dimorphic. Um, One could, give raters a list of 100 names, and probably the vast majority would be gender typical. Of course, there are many names that nowadays would be considered gender neutral. And then in early years, parents will often dress their kids in ways that are gender stereotyped.
Right.
Again, these are all averages. So one can ask, to what extent do social factors play a role in early gender development in kids who are going to develop gender dysphoria? Now, as I said earlier, almost all children with gender dysphoria are somatically, quote, normal. There's no ambiguity about their birth sex, and so they're assigned to one gender or the other. And then what one will hear from parents is that when the child reached a certain age where gender expression is typically first observed, that their child was leaning towards behaviors more typical of the other gender.
Right.
Now, how that comes about, of course, is a source of fierce debate. So some people would say, it's coming from within the kid. Other people might say the child is being influenced by external factors, like, let's say, having an older sister, in the case of a boy wanting to imitate the older sister, although that's, way too simple. Or how parents themselves feel about typically developing gendered behavior or behavior that's more gender variant or nonconforming. And usually parents will say that when their child first started to show these behaviors, they didn't really think much of it. They figured it's only a phase, or all kids do that, or it's kind of cute. And then, as a child enters the social world and they're becoming more aware of gender labels, they may start to affiliate more with kids of the other gender because they're noticing, oh, I like to do what that gender does, but not this gender. And that, for some kids, may lead them to start to think in their mind, well, if I like doing things that girls do, maybe that means I'm a girl. And so then parents have to wrestle with helping a child make sense of that. So, for example, do you have to be a girl to like things that girls typically do? Or can one, quote, be a boy and like these kinds of things? So the evolution of gender dysphoria, I think, is a very slow, gradual process, but can certainly become quite intense by the time a kid is 3 or 4 or 5.
Wow. Before we get into more of the research, I wanted to ask about lexicon. So I understand that the term gender identity disorder is now considered offensive, and gender dysphoria has replaced that term. I wanted to know first why that is, what is offensive about gender identity disorder, and why and when and why gender dysphoria came on to describe this.
Gender identity disorder as a diagnosis first appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980, in the third edition of the DSM. 43 years ago, you had gender identity disorder of childhood and transsexualism. Transsexualism was reserved for adolescents and adults. That remained the same in the DSM-3R in 1987, but in DSM-4 in 1994, those two diagnoses were collapsed and just called gender identity disorder. Now, there was a long interval between DSM-4 and DSM-5, which was published in 2013. In the revision process, there was lots of input from various people. And so, at base, the diagnosis of gender identity disorder itself has always been controversial. So there are some people who don't think it should be a mental disorder. It should be something else.
Right.
So apart from the actual name, there are some people who don't even want it to be in the DSM because they think that it's not a mental disorder.
Right.
And as a sidebar, a lot of people, including media people, will talk about how transgender identity, or the noun transgender, is not a disorder or it's not an illness. And I agree with that. Self-labeling oneself as transgender or having a transgender identity has never been a diagnosis. The diagnosis is gender dysphoria, or it used to be, gender identity disorder. Now, why do some people find the term gender identity disorder offensive? Well, A, they found it offensive that it was in the DSM at all. And also, they didn't like the term disorder.
Disorder, right.
And they would also argue, it's not my identity that's the problem. It's that I have gender dysphoria.
Right.
And the term gender dysphoria isn't bad. I mean, it's used commonly for mood disorders. So somebody has a dysphoric or depressed mood or an unpleasant mood. And the term gender dysphoria was coined in the early 70s. And in fact, one of the first book chapters I ever wrote was in a book that was entitled Gender Dysphoria. So gender dysphoria as a diagnostic term, I think, is quite reasonable because it captures that subjective distress about one's gender. And, there are other diagnoses in the DSM that don't have the word disorder in it, like anorexia nervosa, for example.
Right.
So, it's a little bit political. It's a little bit semantic. I personally don't see that much of a difference, but if gender dysphoria, I think, reasonably captures the phenomenology.
I'm fascinated by the study because in it there's a new line of clinical observation that's suggesting some children with gender dysphoria meets the DSM criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And what's fascinating about this is that the article quotes, "Further research is needed to examine the development pathways by which elevated gender-related obsessionality contributes to GD-autism spectrum disorder comorbidity. If GD is precipitated by ASD, this may have important treatment implications." So to your earlier point about strong and persistent cross-sex behavior, there's linkages. There potentially can be linkages to autism spectrum disorder. I wanted to discuss that further with you. What would those treatment implications be if ASD were identified earlier than GD?
A few preliminaries. In the early clinical literature on gender dysphoria in children, some parents might talk to a clinician and say, my kid is obsessed with gender.
Right.
All he or she does is talk about this 24/7. Some parents would talk about how, my kid comes home from preschool and he has to put on girls' clothes like he needs a fix to kind of calm down and feel better. There is an early interest in the extent to which some kids with gender dysphoria are quite obsessed or preoccupied with gender. Although the counter-argument would be that typically developing children also might be quite obsessed with gender, but because it's more typical of their own sex, parents either laugh it off or just don't think about it.
Right.
So there are a couple of developmental gender psychologists who coined the term PFD for pink frilly dresses, not PDFs, in which parents of little girls would talk about how their daughters would go through a phase where everything had to be pink, and they were obsessed with pink, and eventually the interest fades. But the point is, there might be this early phase of an intense interest. And, what is the line between having an intense interest and an obsession?
Right.
It's a very interesting issue. Now, in relation to the paper you're talking about, where that study came from was that starting in the late 1990s, in our clinic at the time, we started to see some prepubertal children who clearly had gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, who also seemed to be in the autism spectrum. And over the past 20 plus years, this has become a huge topic of clinical and research interest in the field, that there are now lots of people looking at the extent to which children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, that there's an overrepresentation of autism spectrum disorder or autism traits. And I think the empirical evidence confirms that there is an overrepresentation. So then the question is, why is there this co-occurrence? Now, gender dysphoria develops early in development, and so does autism spectrum disorder. That in itself raises very interesting questions about what might the temporal relationship be. Now, I don't think very many people, including myself, would want to make the argument that gender dysphoria would cause somebody to have autism.
Right.
I think people have thought about it more the other way around. So what could the possible mechanisms be? Now, of course, there could be a biological factor that underlies both. Can't rule that out. But what got me interested in looking at obsessionality, in relation to autism, is that we know that lots of kids with autism will develop obsessional interests and will just focus on one or two things. Like they might get preoccupied with wanting to know every street in the city that they live in, or they might become obsessed with washing machines, or they might become obsessed with knowing, every type of automobile there is. And they can drill down all of the differences between different types of makes, or they might get obsessed with a particular country. Or in older kids, they can tell you everything about a particular battle during World War II, and so on and so forth. In little kids, some of the obsessions might strike parents as fairly odd, and they may go along with them, but it isn't like they're wanting to reward them per se. But, for example, suppose like a 4-year-old gets interested in alarm clocks. So do you go out and buy 50 variants of alarm clocks?
Right.
Well, some parents might, but but gender, because it's so dimorphic between boys and girls, some kids who have autism may be predisposed to get very, very focused on gender.
Right.
And because kids with autism tend to think in black and white terms or very rigidly, they might start to think, well, if I like to do A, B, and C, then that must mean that I'm the other gender.
Right.
So in terms of the therapeutic question you were asking, if in fact that's part of what's going on, the therapeutic perspective might be, well, maybe we need to help these kids to think a little more flexibly, and not to think in such dichotomous terms, and help them realize that a girl can do various things and still be a girl, or a boy can do various things and still be a boy. Or to the extent that obsessions help kids in terms of soothing anxiety, because it's a way of calming yourself down by getting very fixated on one thing. If you can help a kid with anxiety, maybe they relax a little bit and develop more flexibility.
Professor, you made an earlier point about making that distinction between when behaviors are obsessive and when they're just of general interest.
Yeah.
I remember as a kid being really into Hot Wheels and then growing out of it. I remember as a teenager being really into video games and then growing out of it. And recently I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and I said, my biggest worry in high school was, doing good on grades and getting the latest video game or whatever it was. But over time, my priorities change. For you and the research you've done, what differentiates general interest versus compulsive behavior or compulsion?
Well, I think that another parameter to also think about in terms of having an intense interest versus an obsession is the extent to which it causes impairment. So, for example, let's say you're very focused on getting good grades. One could say that by and large, that's reasonably adaptive. Although, if one is too obsessed with it, it can cause distress and you actually don't achieve your goals because you're too worried about other things. So one is always thinking about to what extent is a behavior adaptive or maladaptive or, causing distress. And so I think that's one way we might differentiate between an intense interest and an obsession or a compulsion. So, for example, suppose a kid is really focused on wanting to study and get good grades, but the kid says, but I'm so anxious about that. First, I have to spend like 2 hours getting my room properly organized before I can sit down and study.
Right.
So we're always thinking about adaptation.
Right. I wanted to talk about parental reporting on gender dysphoria. Parents act as gatekeepers to determine whether or not their child should be tested for gender dysphoria. And in the article, it mentions parents who are more sensitive to a child's cross-gender behavior may be more likely to have their children clinically assessed for gender dysphoria and may be more likely to exaggerate their child's interest in cross-gender behavior. Parental depression may be one relevant factor to consider. It's fascinating to me that what we've talked about in terms of compulsive and obsessive behavior may exist in the parents themselves when it comes to gender dysphoria. Is that a fair statement?
Well, if it's in a paper that I wrote, it must be right. Though I would tweak it a little bit.
Sure.
So first of all, if one thinks about children in general, little kids in general, it's very rare for a little kid to say, Mom or Dad, I think I need to see a therapist. So it's almost always a parent
Right.
or a teacher or a relative or a family doctor who will suggest that a child be referred, for a mental health assessment in general.
Right.
So in that sense, children being referred clinically for gender dysphoria are
Right.
just like all kids.
Correct.
So the question is, what leads parents to seek out a mental health assessment for their child? And parents vary on that. So there are some parents who do not worry at all about their child being gender nonconforming, including kids who are expressing a strong desire to be of the other gender. So they may never seek out any type of clinical consultation when their kids are little. Then there are other parents who do seek out a clinical consultation for various reasons. And there's a whole range of possible reasons. So for some parents, they may initially think that their kid's gender variant behavior is just a phase, that they'll grow out of it.
Right.
But then it continues, and then parents might become concerned if their kid is starting to express the desire to be of the other gender. So it crosses a threshold for them. Oh, my kid isn't simply liking to do things that the other gender does. They're wanting to be of the other gender. And so that worries some kids. Some parents. Sometimes the threshold gets crossed when the child starts expressing a desire to get rid of their own sexual anatomy. So a kid says, I want to cut off my penis. I want to have girl parts, or vice versa. So that could be another threshold that leads to a request for a clinical assessment. Then another reason might be worries about social ostracism. As a kid gets older, we know from a lot of research that boys who engage in gender variant behavior are more likely to be subject to social ostracism.
Right.
And that worries parents. That's why I think on average, boys tend to get referred at an earlier age than girls, because gender variant behavior in girls is subject to less social ostracism, or it doesn't start to kick in until they're older. And then there are parents who wonder about the long term, like, is my 4-year-old going to grow up and be trans and
Right.
want to have gender reassignment surgery? So some parents worry about things in the long term. And then, to represent the accuracy of the clinical world, there are some parents whose child is showing a lot of gender variant behavior, and parents worry that, oh, this means my kid might grow up to be gay. And that makes some parents uncomfortable. In my clinical experience over many years, how parents feel about the likelihood that their kid is going to grow up to be gay or lesbian varies tremendously. From parents where it's just never been an issue for them and never wound up to be, to parents at the other end of the spectrum where, for various reasons, whether it's cultural, religious, attitudinal, the prospect of their kid growing up to be gay or lesbian is very upsetting. And then everybody else is kind of in between. So in relation to your question, there are various reasons that lead parents to seek out a clinical assessment. Now, do parents over-report behavior because of their own anxiety? Well, that's an empirical question, and you can answer it scientifically, and over the years we've done a lot of research on that. To what extent do what parents report about their kid match what independent observers see? And that's an empirical question that is true in many other domains of clinical developmental psychology and psychiatry. To what extent is there agreement across different observers? And I would say that what parents observe in their kids with gender dysphoria is reasonably accurate. I don't think, by and large, they are distorting anything. So if I said that, I withdraw.
I'd love to have you on to discuss that further, because I feel like that would be such a fascinating discussion. I know we have limited time. I want to ask you about rapid onset gender dysphoria, because everything we've talked about to this point indicates persistent and consistent behavior that leads to a gender dysphoria diagnosis. But there's a push to start thinking about gender dysphoria by online behavior of parents. For example, fourthwavenow.com, leading parents to believe gender dysphoria came, quote unquote, out of the blue, a term called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Have you observed that? And what are your thoughts on that characterization?
This is a huge issue right now in the clinical world of gender dysphoria, and hopefully it will become a huge research issue. It's one of the top 3 or 4 burning issues in the field right now. One is the co-occurrence with autism. Phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria is another really big issue. Starting in the mid-2000s, we noticed a couple of things going on with adolescents. One was a huge increase in the number of referrals, and that's continued to this day all across North America, Western Europe, Australia, and elsewhere, that the number of adolescents being referred for gender dysphoria has increased remarkably from the old days. The second change was that in the mid-2000s, we started to notice that we were getting more referrals of adolescent females than adolescent males.
Right.
So there was a flip in the sex ratio from one favoring males to one favoring females. And we reported on that in a paper we published in 2015, looking at the sex ratio of adolescents with gender dysphoria in Toronto, and the same for adolescents at a gender clinic in Amsterdam. And since then, the phenomenon of there being more referred adolescent females than males has continued everywhere. In my own private practice currently, for example, 70% of the adolescents I see are female. Very similar to what we found like 8 years ago. Now, as part of that, we're starting to see more adolescents in both females and males, but because we were seeing so many more females, it was more obvious that their parents were reporting, my kid never showed signs of gender variant behavior or gender dysphoria in childhood.
Right.
She was a girly girl, and it was only starting around grades 7, 8, maybe a little later, maybe a little earlier, that they noticed that their kid was starting to question their gender. But because it came so suddenly, that's where the out of the blue expression comes from.
Right.
And it wasn't until 2018 when a physician by the name of Lisa Littman published a paper in which she used the term rapid onset gender dysphoria to kind of differentiate it from the more classical early onset gender dysphoria that one sees in very little kids that then continues into adolescence. I think it's a new clinical phenomenon that we just never saw in the old days. Some people have really disliked the whole concept, but I'm not sure they dislike it on clinical grounds or scientific grounds. I wonder if they dislike it on political or ideological grounds because it implies something that may not need to necessarily be assumed to be the case. But I think one of the intense discussions about rapid onset gender dysphoria is to what extent are kids being influenced, vulnerable kids being influenced by social media,
right,
and being influenced by discourse around gender in the social environment, which is very widespread now.
Right.
And let's say that, in fact, that is the case, that there is this social influence. Some people don't like that because it implies a, quote, cause that is not biological. And so that would challenge the essentialist narrative of being born that way. Now, as a clinician, my perspective is, hey, this is a real phenomenon. We need to understand it, and we need to understand, should our therapeutic approach be different with these kids than it is with kids where the onset is much earlier and persistent? So I think there are there are different levels of the debate here. But as a concept, I think it's one of the most interesting developments in the field, that there's a new presentation of gender dysphoria.
That's correct. And without knowing too much about rapid onset gender dysphoria, part of me wonders too is how much of social, societal influence is playing a role into GD referrals. Is it more socially acceptable to explore gender dysphoria as a referral now in the mid-2000s than it's ever been?
Yeah, that's certainly an argument many people have made, including myself, that the diagnosis is less pathologized.
Right.
There's more acceptability, and so it's easier for people to self-identify and say, I think I have gender dysphoria, I need to see somebody. And that's a good thing, because one could argue that, all mental health diagnoses should be destigmatized in the sense that stigma gets in the way of seeking out help.
Professor, I think you've given a wonderful discussion on gender dysphoria. I know we've just scratched the surface on these topics. I'm hoping this isn't our last conversation because there's a lot more to unpack. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming out and sharing with my viewers a little bit about this important issue.
Thanks for asking me, as they say, and be glad to come back.